So it was 1968, June, and my shift started at midnight because it was the night of the California primary, Democratic primary.
Yes.
And we knew that results would be coming in and so forth. So I got to the office just before midnight. And at midnight, 5 after, Bobby Kennedy was shot. And our entertainment writer, Bob Thomas, was
Who I knew.
the only one there for AP. He had been assigned at the last minute because nobody thought anything would happen, that the results wouldn't come in till the morning, and Kennedy would give a speech and Bob would cover it. Bob should have gotten the Pulitzer for that night because he was standing right next to Kennedy, saw him shot, saw blood on his head, and called into the office and said, I have seen the senator and there's blood on his head. He's, mortally wounded. It was the first that anyone in the country knew about it.
Right.
Because TV had stopped broadcasting. And Kennedy was in the kitchen at the Ambassador Hotel. He was not on camera.
Right.
I wrote stories that night.
He called you.
He called the Bureau.
And
he dictated the whole thing. And he said that he actually got up on a steam table in the kitchen, because Bob was very short, as you may remember.
I do.
And he stood up there so he could see Kennedy. That was very dangerous.
Yeah.
And
it was bedlam in there.
it was bedlam. And then Sirhan was arrested, and shortly
And
after
Rosie
that,
Greer almost killed Sirhan right on the spot.
that's right, that's right. It was a scene that I have replayed a million times in my mind because I covered part of the trial, and because I did huge research on it later. When there were
So this
theories.
becomes your first major trial.
It's really my first major trial, but I didn't cover it alone.
Okay.
I was very young at that point, and very inexperienced. I had never covered a trial other than a local trial
So
in New
you
Jersey.
go into a courtroom and you see Sirhan Sirhan.
I do. But there are 2 other reporters from New York who are there doing the main stories. I am assigned to do like the features, the sidebars, the descriptives. Sirhan noticed me, and he has always noticed me, because in recent years I went to one of his parole hearings, and when I walked into the room, he looked up and he went, he remembered me.
Wow.
It's been quite a long trek with Sirhan, because there have been theories that he wasn't alone. That's been a persistent
What
theory.
is your thesis now that you've studied this matter for so long?
Well, I did an interview a short time later with Tom Hayden, who was a very close friend of Bobby's, and was devastated by this whole thing. And I said to him, do you think that Sirhan did it alone?
Yes.
And he said, what do you think? And I said, I'm not sure. I said, I've done a lot of research on this, and I think there's a possibility he wasn't. And he said, do you know why you think that? And I said, no. And he said, you think that because, like a lot of people, you think that significant acts are committed by significant people.
Yes.
And sometimes they are not.
aren't. But his greater point is interesting, that the pattern-seeking creature, the human, has a difficulty reconciling that significant acts can be, okay.
By insignificant people, yeah.
So
I mean,
then,
it's the same thing with Lee Harvey Oswald, and the same thing with Jack Ruby. They were not significant people, but they changed history.
yes. Now, we go to August of 1969.
Okay, this is
You're working at Associated Press.
right.
And then what happens?
I am assigned on a Saturday morning to go to the airport in Orange County to meet President Nixon, who is coming in to see his new Western White House in San Clemente.
Right.
And I am what they call the touchdown person. AP always has somebody at the airport to make sure the president's plane touched down safely. And then you call and you say, he's here, touchdown, and you can leave. So I was there till he touched down. I called in, and everybody was in hysterics at the office. And they said, forget about Nixon, just get in here as fast as you can. There's been a terrible murder up in Benedict Canyon. And there's a movie star involved. They told me it was Sharon Tate. And they said there are a lot of other
Was
bodies.
she modestly well known at the time?
Modestly, not well. I knew who she was because I was covering the beat.
Yes.
And I knew about Roman Polanski. She was his wife.
And these become known as the Manson murders.
Well, later, much later. Right now it was the Sharon Tate murders.
Sharon Tate murders.
And that night, after we had been writing and writing and writing, and I had been getting calls from all over the world, everybody calling about this, at midnight, the CNS ticker, the city news ticker in the room, sprang to life, and I looked at it and I screamed across the room, "My God, it has happened again." And that was the LaBianca murders.
Another set of murders in Los Angeles, in Los
At
Feliz.
the same time, on the same MO, the same thing. People killed, scrawlings of blood on the walls, saying pigs, horrible.
Helter Skelter.
Everybody at that point thought it was a copycat murder. That sent Los Angeles into a state of absolute panic.
Unlike anything you'd ever seen.
Unlike anything the city had ever seen. I mean, the city had seen terrible things, but they had never seen anything quite like this.
Right.
People were going out and buying guard dogs. They were getting alarm systems for their houses. They were not going out. Suddenly, the restaurants were empty. They just stayed home.
Got it.
It was a hot summer. A lot of houses didn't have air conditioning, but no one left their windows open because that's how the killers had gotten into Sharon Tate's. So this became the biggest story it may have been the biggest story to hit LA for all time. And I was assigned to it, and from day one, and I was, looking for possible leads. At one point, they said it was a Satanist group that it was, and I interviewed some guy named Morlock the Warlock, who ran a Satanist church, and he was not involved. And all of this went on and on. It took 3 months before Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, was arrested on an unrelated crime, a theft at a store, and she was in the local jail, the women's jail, and she decided to blab about this to her cellmate, and that was what broke the case. That's what broke the case.
And then how do you first hear the name Charles Manson?
It was from a story by a journalist by the name of Larry Schiller, who is still around.
Yes.
And Larry had negotiated the first interview with Susan. He heard about the confession. There had been some stories written about it, but nothing in depth.
And he
got her interviewed, and it was the lead story in the LA Times on the front page on a Sunday morning. I think people who were here then will never forget it because it was this story of horror of this cult group that lived out at a ranch in the valley under the sway of this evil mastermind, Charles Manson. And ultimately he was arrested up in the high desert at another hideout. Susan was kept in custody, and she named the others who were involved, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten, and the arrests were made. And I will never forget the first day I saw Charles Manson. He was being brought in for arraignment. By then, his picture had been on the cover of Time magazine, if you remember, or Life magazine, with this wild hair and the wild eyes and everything. And you thought you're going to see this monster, right? But I was in the courthouse hallway, and in they brought this little teeny person, barely much taller than I, and I'm 5'1". Charlie's 5'3".
Wow.
And he was so little, and he was wearing this buckskin outfit with fringes, and he just looked absolutely confused. He was looking around at this mass of people. I mean, there were cameras all over the hallway. In fact, there was such a scrim of cameras trying to get a shot of him that they all collided, and they pulled a water fountain out of the wall, and the whole hallway was flooded.
Wow. So the first sight of Charles Manson is a surprising sight in that he's very short. He's
Yeah.
5'3".
Does
He's,
not look threatening, doesn't look like,
he
you know, a
looks
madman.
confused.
He looks confused. He's got kind of shaggy hair.
And then you cover
And then I
the
cover the
most
trial
sensational trial
in
maybe
history.
in history.
Yeah.
And
And
what-
I was not supposed to have done it alone. It was like fate conspired to have me do this by myself.
Destiny also is often written that way.
Oh,
so-
definitely. It was cinematic in a way. The
Shakespearean.
Shakespearean. The Manson family members who testified, and there were like about 100 of them were called to the stand. They were all, you know, portraits out of some kind of
Misfits.
yeah.
But were you able to see or discover what his charisma was?
There was no charisma. He was a very clever con.
He's a con artist. He's a
He
grifter.
had spent his whole life behind bars.
Yeah.
He once said, he testified in the trial with the jury not there. He wouldn't repeat it for the jury. He got up and told his story of his life. And he said, I learned in prison, because I was so small, to tell people what they wanted to hear about themselves.
Yes.